Well, we are excited to have Bronwyn Murphy today with us. She is from University Covenant Church in Davis, California. She is the inclusion coordinator there, and she is going to be talking to us today about all different ways we can set up our children's ministries to be successful for all different types of kids.
Yeah, I'm excited. This is fun. It's gonna be a good time.
Would you tell us a little bit about yourself and your ministry?
Yeah, sure. So like you said, I'm the inclusion coordinator at University Covenant. There aren't too many of us out there in the world in terms of ministry. It's kind of disability ministry is kind of this niche, like sort of up and coming ministry, but it's awesome. And so what I'm able to do is support children, youth, and their families. With disabilities, special needs, additional support needs. We kind of cast a wide net, and we have a whole team. We have a team of interns, we have a team of volunteers that come alongside and support that. And I also do some church consulting for Ability Ministry based out of Ohio.
Yeah, very nice. Can you explain a little bit the difference between a special needs ministry and an inclusion ministry?
That's a great question. So I would say, inclusion at the core is you are including kids or whoever you're serving in with their peers and like the general populace, whatever you're already doing. And that could look all kind of different ways. I don't think there's a hard and fast delineation between the two, but to define inclusion, it is inherently you're including people. Like we don't have a name. Inclusion ministry at our church does not have a separate name. We're just inclusion, and I was pretty passionate about that. Like we're just including people where they already are. We're not creating something separate.
Can you explain a little bit about your structure with that?
So yes, so we're like lots of churches and places, we're in flux, and out here in California we're probably more in flux than lots of the country that's been moving forward a little bit in different pace. So generally speaking, what we have is we have our general kids ministry population, right, and then we have a certain number of children in that that receive additional support for whatever reason. Sometimes they have a diagnosis we know about, and sometimes they don't. Yeah. Like sometimes there's just, especially in the younger kind of preschool, kinder, first grade, sometimes you don't know. So we have a team. I think our youngest buddy he's in third grade, so he's 10. And he supports preschool. His mom helps in the preschool class too. And then our oldest volunteer is retired, probably over the age of 60. So we have all kind of folks in between. We have a large youth population, youth and college population that volunteer with us. And the volunteer requirements, it's actually pretty simple. It's you need to come in with the willingness to build a relationship with someone. So I don't make a huge deal about having to know everything about a diagnosis, because some of our kids don't have a diagnosis, or we don't know, or their diagnosis change, or they get new ones or whatever.
Right.
So the core of it is, are you willing to come and build a positive relationship with someone in this class? And if you are, let's go. Let's get started.
Yeah, very nice. So with that, do you typically pair the same volunteers with the same children, or do you kind of mix it up a little bit?
Both. So what I did that was helpful, and maybe it's helpful to some folks out there listening to whenever you're listening to this, is I took kind of the kids we had been supporting, and I arranged them into tiers. So think of like a pyramid kind of. So the kids at the top, tier 1, they receive the most support. So that is probably at the very least a 1-to-1 buddy. Sometimes there are 2 buddies for one person. And those tend to be more consistent. Number one, because a lot of times it benefits the child to have consistency, and it benefits the family to know when they come who's coming. Some maybe more specialized skills are required for supporting that level of need. The top of the pyramid there, those tier 1 folks actually are supported by a lot of our teens, so because they have the specialized skills to do that. And then you go kind of down into tier 2 kids. Tier 2 kids, may need the 1-to-1 buddy support, but they may be more flexible in what kind of buddy they have because their needs are different. And then tier 3 and 4, that's kind of more situational support. So some of our kids who need support during transitions, or support when we're outdoors, or support maybe reading is difficult. So when we're doing a reading activity, maybe they need some more support. So we can have some more kind of fluid support for that. So I found arranging in those tiers really did help. Like, who needs the most support and what does that look like? And who may be more flexible.
Do you give your inclusion team members specialized training, or is it the same as a general children's ministry training?
So we do kind of a hybrid. So those who are inclusion volunteers get the specialized inclusion training, and then usually whatever kind of overarching values and goals we have for the ministry in general, I also infuse in that, because it's important for them to know, like, this is kind of the direction, children's ministry, or, young preteen ministry is going. And then in terms of general children's ministry volunteers, prior to the pandemic, we were doing a pretty good job of this. Is exactly what this this interview and this talk is about, is how do we make it inclusive for everyone, right? It's not just about those 2 or 3 kids with Down syndrome or this one kid with ADHD. Like, it's about this whole entire class. So we were definitely training and moving that direction in terms of general children's ministry.
Yeah. So I know one of the things you and I had talked about before this interview was that there are certain things that, like, a children's ministry director can start implementing, or small changes that they can do have a big impact on making it easier for kids to be set up for success. Can you kind of talk through a couple of those things where people might be able to get started?
Absolutely. So my background is actually in special education. Prior to coming into ministry, I had a background in special education in various kinds of things, like group homes and public schools and things like that. And in education, when you want somebody to learn something or to do something like that, right? Really what you're going for is maximum engagement of the individual. Yeah. You're really going for how can they be the max engaged. And I know, in children's ministry, we took a survey in our children's ministry, prior to COVID, not that long before. And one of the number one things that volunteers asked for support and guidance on was managing behaviors. And I'm sure if you survey any ministry ever, right, any children and youth ministry ever existed, managing behaviors was probably in the top 3. In education, right, there is a kind of an overriding thought that behaviors happen when people are not engaged. So if you increase their ability to engage, those behaviors will lessen and reduce. So for instance, we, in California out here, we've really not been able to do anything in groups indoors. So we've moved everything outside. And outside, we have found for children and youth ministries is incredibly engaging. Yeah. For preschool, everybody, so engaging. And we have seen behaviors, that we saw in the past, definitely reduced. We've seen engagement a lot higher. We've seen it's just more accessible. Yeah. Because so when you think about a children's ministry, it's like how. We're not just talking at them. We're not just telling them, here's the story of Noah and sit down on your squares, right? Because that's not really engaging, right? There's a lot of passive, we don't want that passive learning. We want people to be active, be able to contribute. So I think when you look at your framework, right, whatever curriculum you're using, however you're structured, you say, okay, how can we get kids really engaged? That's like the core of what you.
What tips would you give someone to help them get engaged?
So for instance, real life example from our ministry is prior to COVID, we had a very large 3rd and 4th grade cohort, and they kind of 3rd, 4th grade kind of stays together. And so we had upwards of 30 something kids plus 6, 7, volunteers, buddies, all the things in a classroom that was used during the week for about 16 preschoolers. So you think we have these much bigger bodies in this much smaller space. Oh, wow. So that created all kinds of problems. So we realized we couldn't do ministry the way we were always doing it because there's just no way to engage in that way. So we said, hey, let's, instead of trying to do a large group, let's split it up into smaller groups. Let's have volunteers lead 2 or 3 small groups. So instead of a group of 30, now you're in a group of 8, right? A whole lot more engagement happens in those small groups. So that's just something we did, like a real life example. I think there is a lot of value in going with your staff, your volunteers, and say, hey, let's walk through what does a general morning in kids ministry look like? Where are the lulls? Like, where is a lot of time, where are we spending a lot of our time? Are we spending a lot of time transitioning kids? Are we spending a lot of times getting kids to stay in a spot, like what are we doing? So I think once you kind of walk through that, right, it's like put yourself in that place. How does it feel to be a kid here?
So Bronwyn, you had mentioned that one of the important things is helping your volunteers see things from the children's perspective. How do you do that?
So one thing we did, and like I said, I wish we would have been able to build this out more before church shut down for 13 months or whatever, was we did a children's ministry training. We had all the volunteers there. So everyone preschool through 6th grade. And we actually went through what it would be to do kind of a multi-sensory lesson. So everyone was in groups of probably 6 or 7 or 8 people at a table. And I just taught it like I was the Sunday school teacher. And I said, okay, let's pretend like you guys are in my class. And our children's director was, passing out the Bibles, like she was like the, like that we would do, right? And she was passing out the materials. So it was like, this is what we're going to do. And it was on Jonah in the whale. Mm-hmm. And so we had, people open the Bibles. And I said, okay, we're also going to understand that some of us do not know how to read because some of our students don't know how to read. So here's what you can do. So kind of, how does this work? And I think I assigned a non-reader at each table. So your job, like, how would you access this, right? What does it feel like to be a non-reader doing this, right? I assigned like a non-reader. And then, we kind of went through the lesson, and part of it was, okay, now we're going to draw the whale. Now we're going to draw Jonah in the whale. Can you see Jonah in that whale? There he is, right? There he is. What does it feel like, right, to be in that whale? That's crazy, right? And then the part where it's like all the kids' favorite part, right? When Jonah's vomited out of the whale, right? We had everyone stand up, and they were like crouched down, like, and then I said, okay, and then I read the verse. I said, okay, when we get there, you're gonna pop out, right? So they jumped up and they popped out. And so it's like this room of like, teenagers, adults, right, doing this, right? But they were able to experience like this is what it could be, right? When you have like, we're drawing things, we're like, and maybe if I was doing the lesson in real time, I wouldn't do every single one of those things with the kids. Right. But I was like, here's like what you can do. Even like, reading the Bible, like put your finger on, okay, we're going to read verse 3. Can you find the tiny 3? Put your finger on that. Can you help your partner find it? Like just taking that extra time instead of just saying, okay, I really want you to understand the story. I really want you to read through the story. It's like, no, let's engage with the story, right? Yeah. So we actually did go through that. We got some good feedback. Like people were like, wow, I would have never thought that. Or some people said, oh, it felt like kind of different because as adults, we don't do that, right? A lot of our work, we don't do that unless you work in children's ministry and you do that all the time. And so to feel like, what would this feel like, right? What does this feel like for the kids, right? What did it feel like for those non-readers? Oh, you're able to see, right, Jonah in the whale. You're able to move and touch things, right? What did it feel like, right, to be that? What did it feel like to be in a group, doing this? And so I thought that was extraordinarily valuable. And that's kind of that was sort of the direction we were moving prior to COVID in training. Like, here's some experiential ways that you can learn and then bring it into your classroom, right?
Yeah, I think that's huge. And I can almost guarantee you that they remembered what they learned and felt in that experience way more than had they just come to a training and listened and got some handouts. Right. And so I love the way you think and the way you really are thinking outside the box and inviting people in. And that's how you make the culture change. It's not about telling, it's about showing and experience. So kudos to you. I love that.
Thank you. It was a team effort, but it was we enjoyed it for sure. You're really making the lesson come alive, and you have like, different ways that kids can engage, right? If you think about the way you learn, right? Think about like, do you like listening to a podcast? Do you like watching something? Do you like doing something, right? Like that's how kids are too. And you're going to probably have a whole range in your classes. So kind of, once you kind of figure out that physical space, what does that look like? And how does the pace of the class go? Then you think, okay, well, where can we add things where kids could be more engaged?
Right. I want to point out a couple of things you just said because I think they are so important. I don't want anyone to miss them.
Sure. Go for it.
Okay. So one of the things I love that you have just told us is oftentimes we see teachers who may be frustrated with kids who are getting distracted or not paying attention, and they look for ways, how can we change the kids' behavior? Well, what you were saying, I think, is what we really need to be asking ourselves first is what can we change ourselves? Because sometimes if you're having the same problem over and over and over again, then it's not the kids that need to change, it's the way we are doing it. So I love what you're saying there, that stop and analyze what can we do differently? Can we do something in a different way that will reach them better?
Our children's director, she's awesome. And she said, I want kids to know about God's big love for them. I want them to understand God's big love. So how do we communicate God's big love? Right. It's hard to communicate that if we're telling people, oh, you need to sit down, pay attention. And if they're having this like really negative experience, it is going to be hard for them to access this idea of God's big love, right? So, if we're kind of coming at it like, hey, we want to have this engaging experience. And I think too, for the volunteers, if you think as a volunteer or staff, like if you're frustrated, the kids are probably also frustrated, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so if you're frustrated as a volunteer, as a staff, you go, okay, it's a lot easier to change yourself than to try to change someone else, right? So, what can we do in our ministries? And we live in an age where there's tons of stuff out there. There's stuff on the internet. I mean, you could like access this talk, right? I mean, there's tons of things out there. And the thing I like about children's ministry is that there is no way it has to be done.
Right. Yes.
There is, and it's going to look different. Like what we do in Davis, California, because we don't have snowstorms,
right.
We don't have blizzards, we don't have ice storms. We could be outside the whole time.
Right.
What we do is going to look different. What someone does in Ohio or Australia or whatever, right? Because it's just a different demographic and a different community. But it doesn't have to be the same. And I think, church. The modern church in general kind of gets into this like, okay, well, here's our program. Here's how we do things. And maybe that works for a season, but maybe that's not for every season, right? I think to be open to changing and to say, well, what is there something that could work better? That kind of like wonder and innovation piece, right?
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. And I think the second thing that you said, I don't want people to miss, is that you said, then we stop and we think, what is this like for the kids? So it's now you're switching and looking from other people's perspectives. And with that, to me, this goes with the environmental piece that you talked about, which is so important because your environment is the first thing you need to really analyze. What's working, what's not, what's working for some kids, but what is melting down other kids? So understanding that different people experience their environment in different ways, and that what might be super engaging for one set of kids might be a barrier for another. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. And I think that goes back to that kind of flexibility and being willing to engage in that like innovation and kind of wonder phase of like, how does this work? So for instance, taking that same example, that 3rd and 4th grade class that I said, so that was our first service, like our earlier service. So that had a lot of kids and just a different demographic. Yeah. But then an hour and a half later, the kids who came in 3rd and 4th grade, completely different demographics. So those two classes were actually run really differently, even though it was the same grade, the same curriculum, the same objectives. It was actually run really differently because the needs were different. It was a much smaller class, but there were several of those kids, kind of in that upper tier 1, tier 2. Yeah. That's just how it was. So the class was just fundamentally different. Yeah. But if we had tried to say, hey, this is the way we're doing 3rd and 4th grade, it'd have blown up in both directions.
Right.
Because, so like to just be aware, like, from, like I said, each kid experiences things differently, and maybe some things are going to work really well with one kid, some are going to really work for another kid. But if you have kind of a multi-sensory, a diverse set of volunteers, people with different backgrounds and skills, you're going to be able to engage a whole lot more kids than if you do the same thing over and over and over again.
Some kids thrive in energetic environments while others become overwhelmed. How do you make it work for all types of kids?
So sometimes the kids will say, I don't want to do the music. It stresses me out. And, they would kind of like, I don't like that. It's too loud. And they say, so we would just have in the back of the room or sometimes outside on our patio, we just have like a buddy read them a story that they liked. Hey, we'll just read you a story. Yeah. And one kid had like his book, like every week, he's like, let's get the car book. So they would read that. And that was kind of a way for him to engage. He could still hear the music, but he wasn't so overwhelmed by it. We also have a small set of Legos for the same reason. So kids that need to be busy and kind of put their focus somewhere, but still engage and not get overwhelmed by what was there.
Right.
So again, it's just being flexible, right? And so instead of looking at it as like, oh, that kid's not participating, right, it's like they're just participating in a different way.
Yes, that is right. And I think that is another huge thing for people to realize that some kids, it may look like they're not paying attention at all, but they're actually receiving everything you're saying in a way that works for them. Whereas if they had to sit there and watch the screen, they wouldn't be able to do it. So it's really understanding what your objective is to reach each kid where they are. There may be a lot of people watching this wondering, well, if you have a kid in the back playing with Legos and that works for them, how do you then stop the rest of the kids from wanting to play with Legos? How do you handle that?
So there's two ways this can go about. So we it's funny to think about this now because we couldn't do it now with COVID and all this stuff.
Right.
So we started that with putty. So we had so a couple kids would kind of have it and they just kind of sit there and do it, and then other kids kind of got really intrigued by it. So then one day we said, hey, let's just everyone get some putty. And oh my goodness, that like changed the whole thing, right? Kids were able to focus. The kids were like, okay, I got my putty, I got my my thing, and they'd roll it in their hand. And we had to teach them like, please don't smash it in the carpet, or like, I mean, they were a little older, but some people still try to put it in their mouth. So it doesn't taste like anything. It looks sparkly, but it doesn't taste good. And so, that was something that kind of normalized that experience. So it actually started as maybe one or two kids really needing something, and everyone like, oh, I want to try this. And so we do the Bible lesson. Okay, while they're reading the story, we're gonna, you could roll your putty in your hand. You could, do this and all that. And again, engagement so much higher, right? Because then kids aren't leaning over, touching each other, standing up, walking around, all that stuff, right? Anyone, right? Disability or not, right? So that's one way it can go. We did that for one class in particular. I wouldn't have done that for every class, but that particular class we realized was going to work. Yeah. And also, on the other end, right? Sometimes it is a matter of explaining to kids, hey, everyone learns differently, right? Everybody learns differently, and this is what's working, for James right now. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes you get conversations, and sometimes the kids go, you know what, Bronwyn, this is actually really loud for me too.
Yeah.
And so I feel like once the kids see that, like, oh, I matter, like the individual, like I matter as an individual, like sometimes you start becoming aware of more needs because the kids are a little more open to that. Yeah. So I say, hey, James is over here, playing with his Lego because he has to be a little farther back from the music, the speaker. It's too loud for him. Right. And they go, oh, can I move back a little bit? Like, yeah. And they go, oh, okay. And you just see like their face like, oh, okay, right. And so I think, there's like this fear, I think, of, oh, we're going to like, this is going to go chaos or whatever, right? But I think a lot of times it doesn't, because when you're really looking at the individual kid, right, no matter if you have 5 kids in your ministry or 35 or 55 or whatever, when you're kind of looking at, what do you need, right? And if we're talking, it's like, that's like how God looks at us, right? Like he doesn't look at us as just like a population of like, okay, well here y'all are, right? It's right. like I know you, right? As you, I know you, Barb, I know you, Bronwyn, right? And so, if we can do that, like I said, in our ministry, we're saying, hey, we want you to understand God's big love for you in the world by giving you that space to work that out, right? Like we're doing that, right? We're living that out. It does take a little bit of a trust from volunteers to say, hey, it's going to work. And it does take some prepping of the class to say, hey, we're all here and we're not all the same, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it could go both ways. Either the whole class, it could be something the whole class ends up doing, which we did that, or it could be something like, hey, this is really what they need right now, and the kids are like, oh, okay.
Yeah, I love that. So I always believe fidgets are your friend, and I was told before, people who don't actually need them will only use them for a short time, then they'll put them down, and then the kids who really need them will use them the whole time, and it will help them. And I've always found that to be really true, and I would think that would be the same for being in a different space or whatever. If you really don't need it, you're not going to want to stay there. Have you found that to be true?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think you kind of think like, oh well, if we offer this to one kid, then like what happens? It's like kind of how like the human mind, that's how we are, right? It's humans. Right. Like, well, I think we automatically go to like, what's the worst thing that could happen, right, when we do this? But I think we also ask, what's the worst thing that could happen, right?
Yeah.
Like what is the worst thing that can happen is like maybe we have 2 kids back there playing with Legos, and instead of like having one kid totally disengaged and sad and then telling their parents, I don't want to come anymore or whatever, maybe they're playing with Legos and they go, oh yeah, I heard that. Right? Yeah. Or hey, I built like my friend, I have a lot of high school boys that volunteer, so this is obviously very exciting, or elementary school kids, and they go, hey, my friend Elliot, my friend Declan, like he played Legos with me, and that was the best part of my whole week, right? So I think we have to be willing to kind of take that risk, right?
Well, I think there's a lot of good things that can happen. And I think too, one thing for people to realize is special needs ministry, inclusion ministry is not just for kids who have diagnosis.
Right.
So you may have some kids that they do need the fidget the whole time, and they get to try it and it helps them, or they do better if they go back to the Lego table. And so I think there's an opening of your mind of what is the objective and what works. What would you tell someone who's afraid that allowing more freedom may be enabling poor behavior?
Funny, as far as like the catering or enabling whatever, I think, well, what's the worst that can happen, right? Like, would you, okay, we could leave them over in the corner, kind of doing their thing and being whatever, right? Or we could like go over and engage them, right? Like, what's the worst that would happen if we go over and engage them? And I'd say, 10 out of 10 times that kid responds, right? Like 10 out of 10 times. And, for me, my own like personal story, whatever, like, I didn't know, well, I wasn't formally diagnosed with ADHD until I was like 35.
Right.
But I knew like I'm like, yeah, of course. I said, I just got around to it. That's classic ADHD. I just got around to doing this. But I think about like all the times that, in my own, church or education, whatever, that it would have been so beneficial for someone to see me for me. Yes. Right. And so, we have kids out there with, maybe no diagnosis or you don't know what's going on. Maybe, we've had things like, the parents are having a really contentious divorce.
Yeah. Right.
Or suddenly kids are living with grandma, or, whatever, right? There's so much going on that, you don't always know. And so to just, again, I think if you're looking at kids as an individual and you're saying, hey, like, I care about you. Yeah. And you're not defined by your whatever. You're not defined by your behavior, your diagnosis, whatever. Because like we don't want someone to define us like that, right?
Right.
They don't want to be like, oh, well, Bronwyn, you're defined by like your disorganization, right? That's gonna be terrible, right? We don't want. So I think a lot of times too as adults, we don't realize the power we have like in a child's life. I don't think we realize like what power we do have to really change and engage kind of change their experience and engage them in a way that really has lasting impact, right?
Right.
They are little people. And, even, the ones that are in 5th and 6th grade, they're still like, they're still little people, right? And we have, the total ability to make positive inroads. And if they equate like that positive adult with a church experience, that's going to inform how they view God, right?
It 100% is 100%.
Right. So if they go to church and they say, wow, that was like super negative, I was getting in trouble all the time. Like I have teenagers tell me that. They're like, man, Bronwyn, I wish we had inclusion when I was a kid because like I was always getting in trouble at church. I'm like, man, how terrible is that, right? Yeah. I mean, and not that there's not, you just let kids do whatever they want, but I think if you're really focused on the goal, we want to build relationships with people, you really start to understand like, okay, that kid, you see them come in and you're like, oh, we're having a moment, right? We need a break or we need to reroute. And so, we want people to do that for us, right? So
yeah, and I think what you said is 100% true. The way someone feels at church, especially when they're young, is how they will associate it with God. That will color their faith, possibly going forward forever. How can churches actually put inclusion into practice?
So I think there's a study out there, Lifeway or somebody, some research group.
Right.
They surveyed pastors and said, hey, basically asking them like, are you inclusive or does inclusion matter to you, right? Special needs and all that. And the overall majority said, yeah, totally, right? But if you look at the churches, right, and you look at the way the churches spend money, or you look at the priorities or whatever, or you look at when the rubber meets the road that day, right, when those kids come in and maybe it's not all going smooth, right? It's different, right? It's different actually in practice than it is in theory, right? And so I think our challenge, I think if you ask anyone, you go, yeah, Micah 6:8, justice, mercy, love, all these things. I don't think anybody would say no to that. I don't think anybody would say no to that, but to actually put it in practice, that's where you say, hey, like this is an individual person, right? This is a class. This is to put that in context, right? Say this is real. It's not just some like theoretical question up there. Exactly. It's not just reading a Bible verse and saying, yes, I'm gonna get like a little, I'm gonna cross stitch that one, put it in my house, right? I love that, right? Like, what are we actually doing about that? Like, are we living that out, and how can we live that out? So.
Right. So when you put it into practice, you build your team with people who want to serve with kids who need additional help. You give them some of them some extra training to understand different needs, right? And you work with all of the different leaders in the church, so you kind of all have the same viewpoint on inclusion and kind of flexibility and what that looks like.
That's the goal. That's the goal.
Yeah, right.
It's like, oh, that's only 3 steps. That's only 3 things. We could do that, right? But like you said, like there's ebb and flow, right, to all of it, right? And inclusion is not just about 1 or 2 or 3 kids. It's not just about diagnosis. It's about making the entire whole right. better.
Real quick, on your outside ministry, how do you make it as safe as possible for kids if you have kids that run or kids that elope? How are you handling that?
Right. So we have a large field behind kind of our main building area. But when we moved to doing exclusively outdoor preschool this fall at the end of summer, we rented a ginormous fence. It's like a construction fence, like the one you'd see. We rented an enormous fence and pretty much fenced in probably about half-ish of our huge field. And then we subdivided the insides. So there's 4 main areas.
Okay.
So that, helps tremendously, right? Because nobody's unless they're gonna climb over the top of the construction fence, which like, you might have someone who can do that. Right. Not saying that's not gonna happen. You might have someone who can do that. It's just inherently safer, right? To be out there. And we put things out there. It's outdoor preschool, so we made it outside. So we got out here. Somebody was giving away redwood, like a redwood trunk, like a gigantic redwood tree trunk, or maybe several of them. So someone went over and they cut that up, and so we have this little redwood grove out there that the kids could walk around on. So we have all these really engaging things out there, right? So kids are playing and doing all these things. We have all these sensory things. One of the teachers at the preschool built, essentially, we call it the mud kitchen. Essentially, it's like a little platform, with all these different little tools and things and there's sand by there, and they pour some water in it to make it a little, nice and messy, so kids can play in there. So I think, again, it's really engaging. So kids aren't trying to climb the construction fence. So, we're kind of thinking about what this is going to look like when we have, more kids outside and, kids maybe more of different ages. That's a reason why we've been able to do children's ministry, youth ministry outside, because we have that fence and there is a boundary, and we've been able to play really fun games, and we've been able to engage kids in a whole different way. Yeah. And even in the winter time, we were the high schoolers. We went through a series on anxiety and depression, and out here, and we have our parkas on, but you guys probably would be wearing shorts. But and kids are just like around, like we have like a little lantern light because the lights went out, a little lantern light, and we're sitting around this like little redwood grove talking about anxiety and depression, right? And it's like that's what we did. So again, outside the box thinking, and again, it's like what's the worst that could happen? Okay, people are cold. But I don't know. It's So I'd say, with eloping or just having those physical boundaries has been really helpful, and just having really engaging things. Like, who doesn't want to run around on this? And
oh my gosh, now I'm going to have an outdoor service because I want to jump on some trees and go down the slide. That sounds really fun. Yeah,
kids will be climbing trees. I'm like, oh, okay, there you are. So I think it's, again, thinking outside the box and not being afraid to do something. And whatever your ministry, maybe, I know some churches have these amazing, like, warehouses, right, that they have like ministries in, and you can have this huge open space to do something really cool. And so I don't know, just think big and just think what could be really fun, or what could be really engaging, and how can we communicate our mission and purpose and values through what we do.
Is there anything else that you would want to share about your ministry, or something you think people should know?
I think from a family standpoint, right, so this is like a disability ministry. It's not just like my job, but it's benefiting my family too. My kids, they all benefit from it in their ways. What they have, going on in their strengths and areas they need support in, and it really can and does change a family. So I think, knowing that what you're doing really actually does change families. In the consulting I do, or even just talking to people in the community or talking to people at my church, there are so many stories of people who say, we tried going to church and it was just such a bad experience because nobody understood my kid.
Right.
And that story is tragically much more common than, you would think, right? And church, unlike school, right, is elective, right? People can decide to go or not.
Right.
There's all kinds of statistics on, who stays home from church and why and all these things. So it really can and does change a family when your church is saying, hey, we want you here. And when you're the parent and you're going to pick up your child or whatever, however the ministry goes, and you're not stressed about, oh my gosh, someone's gonna tell me it's terrible. Like when hey, they understand my child or they care about my child. I've gotten texts from parents, in the morning, they'll say, oh, so-and-so is having a rough day. I go, okay, we got it. It's just like to be able to say like, we got it. It's fine. We'll bring out extra whatever we need, or, we'll quiet the room down or whatever we're going to do. Right. So it really can and does change a family. Like, because, maybe, for some folks, maybe this is what you volunteer, maybe this is what you do on Sundays, maybe this is like what your job is. But for families that are, the beneficiaries of this, like this is their life. This is like their nights and weekends and holidays, right? This is like a part of their life. And so for church to be a place that is positive, like I didn't even know, it's kind of, I spent my whole career in special education pretty much in my kids and all this stuff, but I didn't really know that church was a place that would be inclusive. I just didn't know.
Right.
And once I knew, I was like, oh my gosh, like that's one less thing I have to, like one less place that I have to explain something, or one less place I have to feel self-conscious, or one less place that I don't have to feel like we don't belong.
Yes. Right.
So it really can and does change families. And so this is worth it. Like if your goal, right, like we say is to, it's our mission of our church, our general mission of our church is, it's right there on our website. When you go on, the first thing is that all people would know Jesus, right?
Yes.
It's really hard for all people to know Jesus if they're at home and feeling like they don't belong in church, right?
Yes.
So I think it really, like disability ministry, inclusion, whatever, it really does align with like the mission and purpose of like, why are we doing church, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I have to say.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming, and we are just really grateful for you for sharing with us and for your ministry and for all that you do for the kingdom. So
yeah. Thank you for having me. It's awesome.
Yeah, thank you.